The courtroom went completely silent when Daniel Mercer leaned toward the bench and said the one sentence he probably wished he could take back. "Judge, my religion made me do it." He expected sympathy. Instead, Judge Judy slowly lowered the document in her hand. She did not shout. She did not interrupt. She simply looked at him for several seconds. And somehow that silence was more intimidating than an angry courtroom ever could have been. Daniel was a confident man in his early 40s, dressed in an expensive Navy suit, with the kind of posture that suggested he was accustomed to being believed. Across the courtroom sat Margaret Hayes, a 60-year-old bookstore owner whose hands were wrapped tightly around a small, faded envelope. That envelope had been sitting on the bench since the beginning of the hearing. Daniel had barely looked at it. That was his first mistake, because what was inside that envelope would eventually expose a truth neither side had expected to confront when the case began. And the most important part, Daniel had just given Judge Judy the opening she needed. Before this story goes any deeper, make sure you are subscribed for more powerful courtroom stories like this. And comment below where you are watching from, because this case is about to take a turn that no one in that courtroom saw coming. At first glance, the dispute looked painfully ordinary. Margaret claimed Daniel had taken money from her after promising to complete a renovation project at the back of her bookstore. Daniel insisted he had done everything he was supposed to do and that Margaret was simply trying to recover money because the project had not gone according to plan. On paper, it looked like a disagreement over a few $1,000s. But Judge Judy had already noticed something that made the case feel different. Margaret was not acting like someone obsessed with money. She was not waving receipts. She was not interrupting Daniel. She was not trying to win the room with dramatic accusations. Instead, she kept one hand on that old envelope. Every time Daniel spoke, her thumb moved slowly across its worn edge. That tiny movement told a story before she ever told one herself. Real fear does not always shake. Sometimes it sits perfectly still, Judge Judy noticed. Daniel apparently did not. He continued explaining that Margaret had misunderstood their agreement. According to him, she had become emotional when the project went wrong and was now blaming him for circumstances outside his control. Then he made another mistake. He began talking about Margaret's character. "She has always been suspicious of people," he said. "She sees wrongdoing everywhere." Margaret looked down. Judge Judy's expression barely changed. That was when the narrator of this case would later identify the first real strategy Daniel was using. He was not simply defending the facts. He was trying to make the person telling the story look unreliable. When someone cannot destroy the truth, they often try to destroy the person carrying it. Daniel leaned back in his chair, apparently satisfied with himself. He believed the case was moving in his favor. But Judge Judy had not asked about religion yet. She had not asked about Daniel's personal beliefs. And she certainly had not reached for the envelope. That would come later. For now, she wanted to understand why a simple renovation dispute had become so emotionally charged. Margaret finally raised her eyes. Her voice was quiet. She explained that the bookstore had belonged to her husband, Thomas, who had died several years earlier. After his death, Margaret had kept the business open because it was one of the few places left that still felt like part of the life they had built together. The renovation was supposed to make the aging store safer, a repaired-back entrance, new shelving, a stronger lock, a small reading area that Margaret hoped local children could use after school. It was not a luxury project. It was a promise she had made to herself. Daniel had offered to handle it. Margaret trusted him. That trust, more than the money, was what had brought her into court. And there was something else. Margaret had kept every document connected to the project in that faded envelope. Every receipt, every handwritten note, every payment, every message she believed might matter. Daniel glanced at the envelope for the first time. His confidence shifted for less than a second. Most people in the courtroom probably missed it. Judge Judy did not. She had seen that expression before. It was the look of someone suddenly remembering something they hoped nobody else remembered. The courtroom had not yet heard the most important evidence. But Judge Judy was beginning to understand that the dispute was not simply about a contractor who failed to finish a job. Something had happened between Daniel and Margaret that neither of them had fully explained. And Daniel was about to explain it himself. When Judge Judy asked why he believed Margaret had refused to accept his explanation, Daniel paused. Then he said that Margaret simply did not understand the way he lived his life. Judge Judy asked what that meant. Daniel hesitated. Then came the sentence that changed the entire direction of the hearing. "My religion teaches me that certain things have to be handled a certain way," he said. "So if she thinks I did something wrong, maybe she needs to understand that my beliefs come first." Margaret's fingers stopped moving across the envelope. The courtroom went still. Judge Judy looked directly at Daniel. He seemed to believe he had finally found the explanation that would protect him. But he had misunderstood the question. Religion had not been on trial, Daniel was. And Judge Judy was about to make that distinction impossible to ignore. She leaned forward slightly. "Your beliefs," she said calmly, "may explain what you believe. They don't erase what you chose to do." Daniel's confident expression disappeared. For the first time that morning, he had nothing ready to say. But Judge Judy was not finished. Her eyes moved toward the faded envelope. "Let's see what happened," she said. Margaret slowly placed the envelope on the bench. Daniel stared at it. And the moment his eyes landed on the handwriting across its front, his entire posture changed because he recognized the handwriting. And he knew exactly what was inside. The courtroom just hadn't discovered it yet. Margaret Hayes had not come to court looking for revenge. That was the first thing Judge Judy seemed to understand about her. She had come because a promise had been broken. For 32 years, Margaret had run the small bookstore on Maple Street with her husband, Thomas. The shop was not famous. It did not have a huge online following or a polished corporate sign. It was simply a neighborhood bookstore. People came there for used novels, children's books, old newspapers, and the quiet feeling that somebody behind the counter still knew their name. After Thomas died, Margaret considered closing it, but she didn't. She kept the doors open because the store contained pieces of the life they had built together. A handwritten note from Thomas was tucked inside the original cash register. A photograph of the two of them hung behind the counter, and on the back wall was the reading corner they had created for children years earlier. That corner was the reason Margaret hired Daniel Mercer. The ceiling had begun leaking. Several shelves were unstable. The back entrance no longer locked properly. Margaret wanted the repairs completed before the start of the fall school year. Daniel told her he could handle everything. He gave her a written estimate. He accepted the first payment. And, according to Margaret, he promised something that mattered even more than the paperwork. He promised the job would be done properly. Margaret trusted him. That trust became the real heart of the case. Because the amount of money involved was not enough to explain why Margaret had kept every single piece of paper connected to the project. She was protecting something bigger, her husband's bookstore, her promise to keep it alive, her own dignity. Judge Judy noticed the difference between someone fighting for money and someone fighting because they had been made to feel powerless. Margaret's posture told the story. She never leaned toward Daniel. She never interrupted him. When he accused her of exaggerating, she simply looked at the floor. When he called her confused, she reached for the envelope. And when he suggested she had misunderstood the agreement, she quietly said, "I remember exactly what happened." There was no performance in her voice. That mattered. Experienced judges hear hundreds of explanations. But real pain often sounds strangely ordinary. It does not always arrive with tears. Sometimes it arrives with a person carefully organizing receipts because they are terrified that nobody will believe them without paperwork. Margaret had done exactly that. For weeks, she had saved every message, every payment record, every handwritten instruction, every change Daniel had requested. She had even written down the dates when he stopped appearing at the store. At the time, she thought she was simply being organized. She did not know the envelope would become the most important object in the courtroom. Daniel, meanwhile, had a very different story. He said Margaret had changed the project repeatedly. He claimed she had demanded additional work. He insisted the money she wanted returned had already been spent on materials. And then he introduced the argument that had made the entire courtroom uncomfortable. He said his religious beliefs influenced the way he handled disagreements. He never clearly explained what religious principle required him to keep Margaret's money. But he kept returning to the subject. It became his shield. Whenever Judge Judy pressed him on a factual detail, Daniel shifted back toward belief. Whenever Margaret described a decision he had made, Daniel questioned her understanding. Whenever the evidence became uncomfortable, he spoke about his personal values. That pattern was becoming impossible to miss. Judge Judy watched him carefully. She did not attack his religion. She did something much more precise. She separated faith from responsibility. Daniel seemed to believe those two things could not be separated. But Judge Judy understood that the courtroom was not there to judge his beliefs. It was there to determine what he had done, and what he had done was becoming clearer by the minute. Margaret explained that the first warning came when Daniel asked her to make the second payment before the work was complete. She hesitated. He assured her everything was progressing. She paid. Then the workers stopped coming. Days passed, then weeks. Margaret called. Daniel gave explanations. A supplier problem, a scheduling problem, a family issue, another delay, then another. Eventually, Margaret discovered that some of the materials Daniel claimed to have purchased had never arrived. That was when she began keeping records, not because she wanted to destroy Daniel, because she was beginning to realize she might have to prove everything herself. Judge Judy asked whether Margaret had confronted him. Margaret nodded. She said she had Daniel's response, according to Margaret, was that she needed to stop questioning him. Then Margaret looked toward him. He told me I should trust him because he was a man of faith. Daniel immediately shook his head. That isn't what I said. Judge Judy did not respond. She simply looked at him, then at Margaret, then back at the envelope. Something was beginning to take shape. The case was no longer about whether Margaret remembered a conversation correctly. There was a timeline, there were payments, there were written communications, and somewhere inside that envelope was a piece of information Daniel clearly did not want examined. The narrator could see the deeper meaning now. This case was never really about the repair bill. It was about trust being used as leverage. Margaret had trusted Daniel because she believed his promises. Daniel appeared to have interpreted that trust as weakness. That was the part that seemed to bother Judge Judy most. People who exploit kindness often underestimate the memory of the person they hurt. Daniel had underestimated Margaret, and he had made one more mistake. He had underestimated the woman sitting behind the bench. Judge Judy reached toward the envelope, but did not open it. Not yet. She asked Daniel one final question before touching the evidence. Did you receive the second payment on June 14th? Daniel answered immediately. Yes, Judge Judy nodded. And on June 15th, did you tell Margaret the materials had already been delivered? Daniel paused, just slightly. Then he said yes. Margaret looked up. For the first time that morning, Daniel looked uncomfortable. Judge Judy's eyes returned to the envelope. The handwriting across its front suddenly seemed less like an ordinary label and more like a warning, because Margaret had written one date on it, June 15, the very day Daniel claimed the materials had arrived. And when Judge Judy finally opened the envelope, she found something that made Daniel stop talking. It was not another receipt. It was not another angry letter. It was a single photograph, and in the corner of that photograph was something Daniel had never mentioned, something that could prove whether his entire story was true. The courtroom had just reached the point where belief no longer mattered. Now, only evidence did. The photograph was still lying on the bench when Daniel Mercer stopped pretending he was relaxed. Until that moment, he had been leaning back in his chair, answering questions with the confidence of a man who believed every problem could be explained away. Now he was sitting forward. His eyes stayed fixed on the photograph. Judge Judy noticed, so did Margaret. The picture showed the back entrance of Margaret's bookstore. The date stamp in the corner read June 15. The door was still damaged. The shelves were still unfinished. And stacked beside the entrance were several unopened boxes. Daniel had claimed those boxes contained the materials he had purchased for the renovation. But the photograph revealed something he had not mentioned. The boxes were still sealed, and written across the side of one box was a shipping label. The delivery date was June 18, 3 days after Daniel claimed the materials had already arrived. The first crack had appeared. But Judge Judy was not interested in celebrating it. She was interested in finding out why Daniel had lied. She looked at him. "Who took this picture?" Daniel swallowed. "I don't know," Margaret quietly answered. "I did." Judge Judy turned toward her. "Why?" Margaret looked at the photograph. "Because he told me the work was finished," Daniel immediately interrupted. "That is not what I said." Judge Judy raised one hand. He stopped. The courtroom became quiet again. Daniel had been speaking over Margaret for nearly 20 minutes. Now he seemed to realize that every interruption made him look less confident. The narrator could see the psychological shift. A confident person controls the conversation. A frightened person starts controlling individual sentences. Daniel had moved from explaining the case to correcting every detail. That was a dangerous transition. Judge Judy asked Margaret what happened after she took the photograph. Margaret explained that she had confronted Daniel. She showed him the unopened boxes. She asked why the materials were still sitting there if he had already used them. Daniel told her the shipment had been delayed. Margaret asked why he had previously said the work was finished. He told her she was misunderstanding him. Then came the moment Margaret had written down. Daniel had told her she needed to stop questioning his integrity. He said she was judging him because she did not understand his faith. Margaret had walked away. She did not argue. She went home. And that night, she began putting every piece of evidence into the envelope. Daniel watched Judge Judy carefully. The earlier confidence was gone, but he still had one weapon left, his explanation. He insisted the photograph proved nothing. He said the materials had been purchased and that shipping delays were outside his control. Judge Judy nodded. Then she asked a deceptively simple question. "Did you tell her the materials were already at the store?" Daniel hesitated. "No." Margaret looked at him. "Yes, you did." Daniel turned toward her. "That is not what I said." "Judge." Judy looked back at Daniel. "Then what did you say?" Daniel opened his mouth. Nothing came out. The silence lasted only a few seconds, but those seconds changed the atmosphere in the courtroom. Judge Judy had found something. Not proof yet. A contradiction. And contradictions are where courtroom stories begin to unravel. She turned another page in the envelope. There was a printed text message exchange. Margaret had saved it. Daniel's message was short. He had written that the materials were already there and that the remaining work would be completed within 2 days. The date was June 15, the same date as the photograph, the same date as the shipping label. The same date Daniel had just been asked about. Daniel stared at the page. His attorney, sitting beside him, leaned closer and whispered something. Daniel shook his head. Judge Judy watched them. She did not need to hear the whisper. The reaction had already said enough. The photograph had created doubt. The text message created tension. But Judge Judy still had not reached the hardest evidence. She asked Daniel why the message existed if he had never told Margaret the materials were already there. He tried to answer, then stopped. He tried again. It was a misunderstanding. Judge Judy looked down at the message. A misunderstanding? Daniel nodded. Yes, she looked up. And the photograph is a misunderstanding too. Daniel said nothing. The narrator could feel the power shifting. But there was another layer. The religion argument had not disappeared. Daniel brought it back himself. He said that his actions had been motivated by his religious principles and that Margaret had unfairly judged him because of them. Judge Judy's expression hardened. She did not challenge his faith. She challenged his use of it. Mr. Mercer, she said, belief does not turn a false statement into a true one. Daniel stared at her. The courtroom stayed silent. That sentence was simple. But it removed the shield he had been hiding behind. He could discuss his beliefs. He could explain his values. He could describe his personal convictions. None of those things answered the factual question. Where were the materials? Why had he said they were already there? And why had he taken Margaret's money? Those were the questions that mattered. Daniel's attorney asked for a moment to review the documents. Judge Judy allowed it. Margaret remained perfectly still. Her hand returned to the edge of the envelope. But then Judge Judy noticed something else. There was one more photograph. It had been folded in half. Margaret had not mentioned it. Judge Judy opened it. Daniel's face changed instantly. This photograph showed the inside of Daniel's own work van. Several boxes were visible in the back, the same boxes, the same labels. And beneath them was a handwritten inventory sheet. The date at the top was June 15. But there was something written across the bottom, a note in Daniel's own handwriting. Return these if customer cancels. The courtroom seemed to stop breathing. Margaret looked confused. She had not known about the note. Daniel knew exactly what it meant. The materials had not been delayed. They had never been intended for Margaret's project in the first place. Daniel had planned to return them. And suddenly, the case was no longer about an unfinished renovation. It was about whether Daniel had accepted Margaret's money while knowingly planning not to complete the work. Judge Judy looked at him. He lowered his eyes. For the first time, the man who had entered the courtroom believing his religious explanation would protect him looked genuinely trapped. But Judge Judy was not finished. She had one final question, and this question would force Daniel to choose between another lie and the truth. She placed the photograph beside the text messages. Then she looked directly at him. Mr. Mercer, whose name is written on that inventory sheet. Daniel stared at the page. The answer was obvious. His own handwriting, his own name, his own plan. And when he finally looked up, the confidence that had carried him into the courtroom was gone. But the biggest reveal had not happened yet. Because Judge Judy had discovered something inside the envelope that could explain why Margaret's renovation was never Daniel's real plan at all. And this time, the evidence was not a photograph. It was a recording. The courtroom was already tense when Judge Judy reached for the recording. Daniel Mercer knew what was coming. His attorney knew. Margaret did not. She stared at the small recorder on the bench as though she had never seen it before. Judge Judy looked at Daniel. Is this your voice? Daniel's answer came too quickly. I don't know. That was the wrong answer. Because only minutes earlier, Daniel had confidently claimed that he remembered every conversation with Margaret. Now he suddenly could not recognize his own voice. The lawyer beside him lowered his head. Judge Judy did not react. She simply pressed play. The recording began with the sound of a door opening, then Margaret's voice. Daniel, I just need to know when you're going to finish. A few seconds passed. Then Daniel answered, You need to stop worrying about it. Margaret asked why the materials were still unopened. Daniel laughed. Not nervously, not accidentally. He laughed as though the question itself were ridiculous. Then his voice became colder. You trusted me because you thought I was a good person. That's your problem. Margaret's face changed. She had heard those words before. But hearing them inside a courtroom was different. The recording continued. Daniel told Margaret that she had no idea how business worked. Then he said something that made Judge Judy stop the recording. "Your beliefs don't give you the right to keep my money." Margaret's own voice could be heard. Daniel responded immediately. "Don't use your beliefs against me." The courtroom went silent. Judge Judy looked at Daniel. He stared at the floor. The narrator could see the contradiction clearly. Daniel had entered the courtroom claiming religion explained his actions. But the recording showed something very different. He had used the language of faith during the dispute, not to accept responsibility, but to pressure Margaret into stopping her questions. That distinction mattered. A belief can guide a person's choices. It cannot become a permission slip for dishonesty. Judge Judy pressed play again. Daniel's voice returned. This time he sounded irritated. "You want your money back? Fine, but don't pretend you're some innocent victim," Margaret answered quietly. "I trusted you." Daniel laughed again. "Then you should have known better." The recording stopped. No one moved. Margaret looked down at her hands. Her eyes were wet, but she did not break. She had not come to court to humiliate Daniel. She had come because those words had stayed with her. For weeks, she had wondered whether she had been foolish for trusting him. Now the courtroom had heard the truth directly from his own mouth. Judge Judy looked at Daniel. "Is that your voice?" Daniel finally answered. Yes. It was the first completely honest answer he had given in several minutes. Judge Judy nodded. Good. She picked up the inventory sheet, then the photograph, then the text messages, one piece at a time. The proof ladder was complete. The photograph showed the materials existed. The shipping label showed they had not arrived when Daniel claimed they had. The text message showed he told Margaret otherwise. The inventory sheet showed he planned to return the materials if the customer canceled. And the recording showed how he responded when Margaret questioned him. The evidence was no longer a collection of unrelated documents. It was a timeline. And that timeline told one story. Daniel had accepted Margaret's money. He had represented that the materials were already available. He had not completed the work. He had planned to return the materials. And when Margaret challenged him, he used her trust and his religious identity as pressure. Judge Judy leaned back. Daniel's face had changed completely. The man who had walked into court believing he could control the narrative now seemed unable to control even his own expression. His attorney whispered something again. Daniel shook his head. Then he made one final attempt. He said the recording had been taken out of context. Judge Judy looked at him. What part? Daniel froze. What part was taken out of context? He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Judge Judy waited. She did not rescue him from the silence. That was important, because silence can reveal what words try to hide. Daniel finally said he could explain. Judge Judy answered calmly. Then explain it. He looked at the recording, then the photograph, then the inventory sheet, then Margaret. There was nowhere left to go. His explanation had collapsed under the weight of his own evidence. The courtroom could feel it. Daniel had entered believing the case was about a disagreement between two people. Judge Judy had turned it into a question of accountability. Then she asked the question that finally broke his confidence. Mr. Mercer, if your religion required you to be honest, why did you need so many explanations? Daniel stared at her. No answer, Judge Judy continued. The court is not asking what you believe, it is asking what you did. Daniel's lips parted, still nothing. That was the moment the title of the case finally made sense. He had blamed religion for his actions. Judge Judy had refused to let him hide behind it. And now the courtroom was waiting for the final piece. But there was one more discovery inside Margaret's envelope. Judge Judy turned the last page. It contained a list of 3 other customers, different names, different projects, the same pattern. Daniel's lawyer immediately stood. Your Honor, Judge Judy raised her hand. Sit down. He sat. Daniel looked at the list. His face went pale. because Margaret had not known about those other names when she came to court. Neither had Judge Judy. And if those three people had experienced the same thing, then this was no longer simply Margaret Hayes versus Daniel Mercer. It was the beginning of a much bigger question: how many other people had trusted him? And how many had stayed silent? Judge Judy closed the envelope. The courtroom had reached the point where the truth could no longer be contained inside one case. The next document would reveal why. Judge Judy placed the final page on the bench: 3 names, 3 customers, 3 dates, and beside each name was the same handwritten note, "paid in advance." Daniel Mercer stared at the page. His attorney leaned toward him and whispered something urgently. Daniel did not answer. For the first time since entering the courtroom, he looked like a man who understood that the evidence was no longer asking questions. It was answering them. Judge Judy looked at Margaret. "Where did you get these names?" Margaret shook her head. "I didn't know who they were." That answer surprised everyone. Judge Judy turned back toward Daniel. "Then, why are they in your handwriting?" Daniel swallowed. "They're old customers." "Customers for what?" "Renovation work." Judge Judy nodded slowly. "And did they all pay you in advance?" Daniel hesitated. "Yes." The room became still. Judge Judy looked at the list again. "And did all 3 projects remain unfinished?" Daniel's silence answered before he did. One of the names had a phone number written beside it. Another had a date. The third had the words, "refund requested." The pattern was becoming impossible to dismiss. But Judge Judy still refused to assume anything. She wanted facts. She asked Daniel whether he had refunded those customers. He said he could not remember. That answer changed the atmosphere because only minutes earlier, Daniel had claimed he remembered the details of Margaret's case perfectly. Now he suddenly could not remember 3 other people who had paid him in advance. Judge Judy looked at his attorney. "Do you have records?" The attorney opened a folder. He began searching through it. Daniel leaned closer. Then his attorney stopped. There were no refund records. No completed contracts, no proof of finished projects, nothing that explained the 3 names. Judge Judy turned toward Daniel. "Mr. Mercer, how many customers have you taken deposits from?" Daniel said he did not know. Judge Judy asked again. He still could not answer. The narrator could see the final collapse beginning. The problem was no longer Daniel's confidence. It was his memory. A person can rehearse an explanation. They can rehearse an excuse, but they cannot easily rehearse every forgotten detail of a pattern. The list had exposed something much deeper than one dishonest statement. It suggested that Margaret's experience might not have been an isolated mistake. And then Judge Judy noticed the handwriting beneath the 3rd name. There was a small sentence: "Don't refund unless pressured." Daniel's face went pale. The courtroom froze. Judge Judy held the paper up. "Did you write this?" Daniel stared at it. He did not answer. "Mr. Mercer?" "Yes." The answer was barely audible. Judge Judy placed the page down. "Why?" Daniel looked toward his attorney. The attorney did not speak. Daniel finally said the customers had agreed to wait. Judge Judy asked whether those agreements were written down. "No." "Did they agree to let you keep their money indefinitely?" "No." "Then why did you write that?" Daniel had no answer. Judge Judy looked at Margaret. Margaret was no longer holding the envelope. She was sitting completely still, the same woman who had entered the courtroom, uncertain whether anyone would believe her, now had something she had not possessed that morning: certainty. She knew she had not imagined what happened. She had not misunderstood. And she had not been wrong to question him. Judge Judy turned back to Daniel. Then came the question that stripped away the last excuse. "Did you use your religion to make these people feel guilty for asking for their money back?" Daniel shook his head. "No." Judge Judy lifted the recording. "Then why did you tell Margaret that questioning you meant she did not respect your beliefs?" Daniel said nothing. Judge Judy waited. The silence stretched. Finally, Daniel whispered, "I was angry." Judge Judy nodded. "And that's the answer." Not because anger excused him. Because it explained something, Daniel had not been acting from some mysterious religious command. He had been angry that someone challenged him. He had used faith as a shield after being confronted. The difference mattered. Religion had not forced him to make the choices revealed in that courtroom. He had made them. And Judge Judy made sure everyone understood that distinction. People can have beliefs, she said. People can have principles. But when someone uses those beliefs to avoid responsibility for their own decisions, the belief is no longer the defense. The decision is. Daniel looked down. The arrogance was gone. So was the rehearsed confidence. What remained was a man staring at evidence he could no longer explain. Judge Judy then turned to Margaret. She asked what Margaret wanted. The courtroom probably expected her to demand punishment. She did not. Margaret said she wanted the money back. But then she added something unexpected. I want him to stop doing this to people. Judge Judy looked at her. That sentence changed the emotional weight of the case. Margaret was not asking for revenge. She wanted the pattern to end. And suddenly, the faded envelope made sense. It had never simply been a collection of receipts. It was a record of someone refusing to let herself be erased. The photograph, the messages, the inventory sheet, the recording. The names. Each piece started as something small. Together, they had become a story. Daniel had entered the courtroom, believing Margaret was one angry customer. He was leaving the evidence room looking like the first person who had finally connected the dots. Judge Judy ordered the disputed money returned to Margaret. She also made clear that the additional evidence raised concerns that belonged beyond the simple payment dispute, and the appropriate records should be preserved and reviewed. Daniel's attorney began gathering the documents. Daniel remained seated. He looked at Margaret for several seconds. Neither spoke. Then Daniel quietly said, "I'm sorry." Margaret did not smile. She did not celebrate. She simply nodded. Because the apology could never erase what had happened. But it meant something that the truth had finally been spoken without excuses. The courtroom began to settle. Yet Judge Judy had one final point to make. She looked at Daniel, and the man who had once blamed religion for his actions suddenly looked like he wished the courtroom would end before she said another word. It was too late. Judge Judy had already reached her conclusion, and her final response would become the line everyone remembered. The courtroom had heard the evidence, the money, the photograph, the messages, the inventory sheet, the recording. And finally, the list of other customers whose names had appeared in Daniel Mercer's own handwriting. There was nowhere left for the story to hide. Daniel sat quietly beside his attorney. The confidence he had carried into the courtroom that morning was gone. He had entered believing that his explanation would be enough. He had believed that if he spoke confidently enough about his beliefs, Margaret would begin to look unreasonable. He had believed the case was about an emotional customer demanding money. But the evidence had changed everything. It was about choices. Judge Judy looked down at the documents one final time. Then she looked at Margaret. Margaret sat with her hands folded in her lap. The faketed envelope rested on the bench. It had started the morning looking like an ordinary collection of papers. Now it represented something much larger. It represented the moment Margaret stopped allowing someone else's confidence to make her question her own memory. Judge Judy turned toward Daniel. The money Margaret paid you is not yours to keep. Daniel nodded. The evidence shows that you represented the work differently from what actually happened. Another nod. And when Margaret questioned you, you brought your personal beliefs into the argument instead of answering the questions. Daniel lowered his eyes. Judge Judy's voice remained calm. That calmness made the words carry even more weight. You are free to practice your religion. You are free to hold your beliefs, but you are not free to use them as an excuse for choices you made yourself. Daniel said nothing. Then came the sentence the courtroom had been waiting for. Judge Judy looked directly at him and said, Faith can guide your conscience, Mr. Mercer. It cannot carry the blame for decisions you knowingly made. It was the kind of line that did not require shouting. It did not need a dramatic gesture. It simply landed. Daniel stared at the bench. Speechless. For once, there was no explanation, no reference to misunderstanding. No argument about belief, no accusation against Margaret, nothing. Just silence. Judge Judy ordered Daniel to return Margaret's disputed payment. The additional records were to be preserved for appropriate review because the evidence concerning the other customers raised questions that went beyond Margaret's individual claim. The courtroom slowly relaxed. Margaret finally released the envelope. Her fingers had been gripping it for nearly the entire hearing. Now, she let it rest on the bench. She did not look triumphant. She looked relieved. That distinction mattered. She had not come to destroy Daniel. She had come to prove that she had not imagined what happened. And when Judge Judy confirmed the outcome, Margaret closed her eyes for a moment. Not because of the money. Because someone had finally believed the evidence, the narrator could see the emotional truth of the case. Sometimes people think justice is about winning. But for someone who has spent weeks being told that their memory is wrong, their questions are unreasonable, and their pain is exaggerated, justice can be much simpler. It can be hearing someone say, "You were right to question it. You were right to keep the records. You were right not to give up." Outside the courtroom, the consequences continued. Margaret returned to her bookstore. The damaged back entrance was eventually repaired. The children's reading corner stayed, and the faded envelope remained in a drawer behind the counter. She kept it, not because she wanted to remember Daniel. Because she wanted to remember the day she stopped doubting herself. The documents connected to Daniel's other customers were preserved for review, and the evidence raised questions that could no longer simply be dismissed as one disagreement. Daniel's reputation among the people who had heard what happened was badly damaged. But the most important change was quieter. Margaret no longer looked at the bookstore as something she was barely keeping alive. She looked at it as something she had protected, something that still belonged to the life she and Thomas had built. 3 days after the hearing, she reopened the reading corner. A group of local children sat on the floor while Margaret read to them. The same bookstore, the same shelves, the same old cash register. But Margaret was different. She no longer carried the same uncertainty. The faded envelope was still nearby. So was the photograph. The symbolic object that had begun as proof of a broken promise had become something else, a reminder that small details can protect people when powerful explanations fail. And that may have been the deepest lesson of the entire case. Daniel had tried to make the courtroom debate his religion. Judge Judy refused. She kept bringing the conversation back to something much more uncomfortable. Personal responsibility, because beliefs can influence a person. They can shape values. They can guide choices. But they cannot become a substitute for accountability. The case was never really about religion. It was about what happens when someone takes something deeply meaningful and uses it to avoid answering a simple question. What did you choose to do? Daniel had answers for everything except that. And eventually, the evidence answered for him. That was why the courtroom became so quiet when Judge Judy delivered her final response. The silence was not confusion. It was recognition. Everyone understood what had happened. A man had walked into court believing his confidence could control the story. He walked out having learned that evidence does not care how confident a person sounds. And Margaret walked out carrying the same faded envelope she had brought in, but it no longer felt heavy. She had brought it into court because she was afraid the truth would disappear. She carried it home because the truth had survived. That is the image worth remembering. Not Daniel's expression, not the argument, not even the verdict. Margaret, standing outside the courthouse with that old envelope in her hands, finally knowing that she had been heard. Because sometimes justice is not loud. Sometimes it is simply the moment a person who was made to feel invisible realizes that somebody finally saw the truth. And if there was one lesson from this case, it was this. Never confuse someone's confidence with their innocence. Never confuse someone's beliefs with their accountability. And never let another person's certainty make you abandon your own evidence. The truth does not need a perfect voice. It needs someone willing to preserve it. If this case reminded you that accountability matters, subscribe for more courtroom stories where arrogance finally meets consequences. And comment below with what you would have said if you had been sitting in that courtroom when Daniel blamed his actions on religion.